I was born in Regina in 1972. My mom was 15 when she had me, and she was 14 when she got pregnant with me, and my birth mom. And my birth mom had made a decision early on, by the time she was actually 11, that because of her experiences with men who had sexually abused her, that if this is what men are about, they're going to pay for it. And so she started working in the streets in Regina, Saskatchewan at that time. And when she, early on, she got pregnant with me from a John. So I lived with her up until I was about 14 months old and in the home with her. And she lived in the home with my grandmother and siblings, so my aunties and uncles were there. So I have some aunties also that are like just a couple years older than me, which is kind of cool. So they all knew me. I was kind of the only baby around. And there was this white man who would visit the house on a regular basis and kind of, was a sort of a friend of the family. But he happened to be a sex offender. And so he had abused my mom and others in the house. And one day my mom, she was outside and somebody had come out and told her that this person was in the room with me and abusing me, and Mom came flying in the house and attacked him, and the police were called, and instead of taking the man away white man away who had sexually abused so many of the kids in the house, they took me away. And so they carried me out of the house in my diapers, and my mom thought, in her mind, she had thought that when she calmed down that they would bring me back, and I just never came back. She didn't sign anything, she didn't do anything, I was gone, and she just never saw me for decades later. I went into foster care, and then my parents who had come down to adopt me had kind of some ideas. They wanted, somebody who was walking, who was out of diapers, and somebody who would sort of blend into the family, and so my profile was the one that they were shown because I was fairly white passing. And so they came down to see me in the foster home in the morning. One morning, I was 2 years old by this time, one morning, and then they left, and then they came in the afternoon, and they took me to the park. And when we came back to the house, my stuff was all in a garbage bag, and I left with them. And one of my cousins in my adoptive family who lived in the city still remembers, and he's way older than me, he remembers to this day how he felt traumatized because my parents drove by the house and they held me up to the car window to show them, me, but didn't feel like they should stop or anything because they thought it'd be like too traumatic for me. And so then they drove 3.5 hours northeast of the city, and that became my new home. They never had a social worker check on them again to inquire how I was or what was going on. And it wasn't until years later that I realized when I went into the University of Regina at the Saskatchewan Indian Federated College, it was called at the time, which became the First Nations University of Canada, that there was this thing called the 60s scoop, and that all these kids, it wasn't just me, that had been taken, and there's tens of thousands of us across this country that had been stolen from our families. And so it made sense why I was taken out of the house and why all of my siblings after me were just taken out of the house instead of the certainly white people at that time or white pedophiles at that time. And so I always knew I was adopted. I always knew I was Indigenous. And when I left home and went back to Regina to go to university and found the Indian Federated College, I just remember just being starstruck because there was so many Indigenous people I didn't know. I was not led to believe that Indigenous peoples would go to university. And so I was just stunned. There's all these Indigenous students from all over. There was Indigenous professors, Indigenous administrators, everything. And as soon as I walked in that door, they knew who I was in a way that I didn't know who I was. They didn't know exactly my family, but they knew exactly why I had been taken away and that I was coming back. And it was at that point where I really started to learn about who I was from people who did know who I was versus, you know, the previous 16 years of my life. And so I started learning about who I was and understanding the 60 scoop, residential schools, the systemic racism that occurs. And so when you talk about my first racist experience that I know of for certain was the fact that I was carried out of the house that day instead of a pedophile. So, you know, I think the systems the way they've been set up against us are horrific. And after I got to Regina and started to learn who I was and started to understand that the things I had learned about being Indigenous, like the negative stereotypes, were not what being Indigenous was about. And so I started to learn about who I was and our people, and understanding the root causes of the stereotypes, the negative stereotypes that we see today, and the trauma and the violent colonization and the history of all that. And so as I learned that, then I started to feel confident and proud about who I was. And I started to write to the government to try and find out more about me and to find out specifically where I had come from. And so I have a file literally about this thick of correspondence to the government, different government agencies, over 25, actually it's still ongoing, so we're getting close to 30 years now, of trying to find out different information that the government has on record about me. One of the first letters I got back, and I was not expecting it because I was young, and maybe because I just, I don't know, didn't quite understand the depth and the breadth of what had occurred. I got a letter back that told me that I had 7 siblings born after me. And it listed their first names, their years of birth, and the year that they went into care. And then I realized that I was in my early 20s. I had 7 siblings, 6 that I knew that I thought were still living, and some of them were still in foster care. And so I thought, I kind of like panicked, because I'm like, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to like find them all and take care of them? And so I mean, it was a struggle, but I started the journey to try and find out where everybody was. It literally took me 25 years, start to finish, to find my last sibling, who's out here in Ontario, and then up until 3.5 years ago to meet my niece and my 2 nephews, and my brother that's out here. During every sibling that was born after was taken, and they were spread out between Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and out here to Ontario. And as I've had more conversations with so many people about the 60 scoop and so many others like me who were stolen, it feels really weird to say that I feel lucky in that I survived the home that I went to. And that I went to a home that didn't lock me in a cage, that didn't make me become like farm labor and sleep in a separate house or shed from the rest of the family, or wasn't, violently or sexually abused in the home that I did grow up in my adoptive family. But many were not at all so lucky, right? And so, yeah, so when I was 26, 27, I found my mom. That was the first person I found was my mom. The first person I found was my mom. And I remember when I first saw her. She was, I just couldn't stop staring, because I had never seen in my life somebody, like, people take it for granted, like you hear, oh, you have your mother's eyes, or your dad's hands, or something like that, and I had always heard growing up, like, I don't know where you get that from. And so as soon as I saw my mom, like, I saw exactly why my hands were the way they were. I saw, the ears, the eyes, everything, and I just couldn't stop staring. But and people like to ask about like have this be a feel-good story, and feel like, oh, it's so wonderful and great, you found everybody. But it's not, I mean, it's not wonderful and great. The damage that's been done to my family and my siblings, who are mostly unwell, some periodically in jail, for minor things, you know, for criminalization of things like poverty, homelessness, what I call nickel and dime substance abuse, to cope with what's gone on. My brother out here, he's just 3 years younger than me, and he, you know, he just said that once he moved out here, and he knew he was from Saskatchewan, he'd been moved to Manitoba and then out here and then was on the street, he just thought that there was no way that he could possibly ever find his family again. And then at one point he asked me if I thought that finding my family earlier on and knowing who I was, if I thought that had like positively impacted me. And I mean, it did, right? It absolutely did, because like I was able to understand things differently. But when you think about, you know, an Indigenous man in his 40s who has been so lost for so long, and there's again thousands across this country who know that they've been stolen, and the foster homes he was in were not the experience that I had, and yeah, it's just absolutely devastating. So, but my mom, one of the things she said to me wasn't like worried that I'd be angry that I got adopted, or wasn't concerned that I'd be angry because she's still a substance abuser. Her only thing that I've heard her say that she was concerned about was that she thought I would be mad that she made me an Indian, which just tells me how deep, you know, the understanding and the depth of the experience of racism has been in my family. Yeah, that's just, out of all the things, that's like the hardest and saddest thing for me to hear. And so I think partly because of that is why I, you know, take it just so, it's just so important for me to be, you know, unapologetically a two-spirit, indigiqueer, Indigenous person, you know, to show others and to help others know that, you know, we don't need to be ashamed. We don't need to be ashamed that we don't know our language. And people try to shame us for that. They'll say like, oh, you know, you don't know your language, or I know more of your language than you do, or I'm darker than you when I tan, or you know, you don't even know the reserve you're from. These are things that people say to us, and my response back, and what I, you know, talk to youth about saying back, is like, that is not our shame. What a good response is like, yeah, and that's a product of the violent colonization and white supremacy that has been enacted upon us for generations. And the fact that we're still here, and that we're, you know, able to be at a space like this and come together and gather and be in, you know, the universities and in politics and in all sort of different fields, is only because of the undeniable strength and perseverance of our ancestors and what they went through to fight to be able to put us here. So for me to be able to be unapologetically Indigenous is nothing compared to what they had to go through.